So this is part 3 of reviewing Algebra 1 concepts. In this one, we're going to be talking about basic math vocab that you might see, such as coefficient, constant, equations, and expression. The first two that I want to go over is expression and equation because they often get mixed up, but they are different. So expression is a math phrase. Let me see if I can erase that. There we go. Let me grab my pen again. Phrase that combines or can combine numbers or things that we can also call as constants. Constants and numbers kind of go hand in hand. Variables. So variables are like X, Y's, and Z's. Symbols, basically. And operators. Operators are basically like plus signs, division signs, multiplication signs. Those are operators. And they are different from equations. Equations, the key thing about equations is they have an equal sign. So let me write that down. Has an equal sign. And it helps separate two expressions. So imagine that you have two expressions, and I'm going to use the example down below to show this. So when you're looking at this equal sign here, that automatically tells me that this here is an equation. So this entire thing right here is an equation because there's an equal sign. So we're going to call this an equation. And so on this side here, this whole piece here, what we're going to write right here is an expression because it has a combination or it contains either a number, a variable, or an operator. So notice the operator here is a plus sign. And so there's constants here. There's a variable. And this side here, there's only a 20. But this here, typically we would call this a constant. But because it's on this side, we're going to call this also an expression. We can also call this an expression, or you can call it constant. So now let's get down to this bracket here. This bracket's focusing on just the 3x squared. Because this 3x squared is being separated by the plus sign, this expression here has two terms. So this is pointing out that this is one term. This is what we call a term. So this is a term, and the 5's a term, the 20's a term. So notice that two expressions make an equation. Expressions are made of terms. And now let's get into what each symbol here represents. So in this case, this 3 is a number. So we call that a constant. But in this case, because this number is in front of an x or a variable, we call this specifically a coefficient. So coefficients are constants that are in front of a variable. Now, this arrow here is pointing to the x. That x is being a variable or represents as a variable. And then the 2 here is an exponent because it's a tiny, tiny number above the x. So we call that an exponent. And then the 5 here is just a standalone 5. And the 20 here is also standalone. So because they're by themselves, there's no x beside it, we call these a constant. And that's it. That's basically your hierarchy for an equation. So let's do some examples where we're translating these algebraic, these verbal expressions into algebraic expressions. So we're going to turn this into this. So let's get a closer look at these example problems. So let's see if I can pull that down so that way we can see. Alrighty. So the first problem here says that the expression has a coefficient of -8 and two other factors. One factor is squared and the other is raised to the 5th power. Now, what I like to do is go back and highlight the key words like coefficient, variables, constants. So what I notice immediately is that it is asking for, grab my yellow highlighter. It says coefficient. The expression contains a coefficient. Let me see if I can make that darker. Of -8. Two other factors. So let's just stop right here. When it says coefficient of -8, I'm thinking that there's going to be a -8 someplace. And it says two other factors. When we think of factors, factors means multiplication. Like if you have a factors of, let me use this as an example. If someone asks you what are the factors of 6, you might say 2 and 3 because those two numbers multiply to give you 6. So anytime you're thinking of factors, think of multiplication. And so multiplication, we're going to be seeing two things multiplying each other. But they didn't tell us what two things are multiplying each other, so we're going to use a variable to symbolize that. So I'm going to use just any letter, maybe X. But because there are two factors, I need an X and then I need another letter. So I'm going to use Y. Now, you don't want to use two X's because then you're saying that the two factors are equal to each other. And we don't know that's the case. Now, after that, it says that one of the factors, let's just choose X to be that factor, is squared. So I'm going to highlight that piece. So one of the factors is squared. And the other factor, the other is raised to the 5th power. So this is saying that one of the factors, let's say X, is squared. So I'm going to put a 2 there because squared means an exponent of 2. And then the other is raised to the 5th power, so the 5th exponent. So I'm going to use the Y and say it's to the 5th power. And then after that, there's nothing left that it says. So this is it. This is my algebraic expression for this sentence. Let's try another one. So for B, this says the expression has 3 terms. So I'm going to underline that. So I know that I'm going to have 3 terms. In fact, I'm actually going to, just to help me kind of see, I'm going to make 3 lines. Because I know that there's going to be 3 terms. You don't have to do this, but I like to do that. And then the next thing says that the coefficient of the first term, so the first term, is a -5, and it has one factor that's raised to the 4th power. So this is saying that the coefficient is a -5, so I'm going to put a -5 out in front. And it also says it has one factor, so factor meaning it's going to be a variable, right? So I'm going to put a variable there. And it's raised to the 5th power, so I'm going to say that that is to the 5th power. Oh, sorry, not the 5th power, the 4th power. I can't read. It says to the 4th power, so I'm going to make a 4th power here. Now, the next part, it says that the second term has a coefficient of 6. So let me highlight that. So it has a coefficient of 6 and 2 other factors, one squared, the other cubed. So this is for the second term. So let's write that down. So the second term has a coefficient of 6 with 2 other factors. So let's use a different letter here. So I can't use X anymore, so maybe Y and Z. One is squared, so maybe the Y is squared, and the other is cubed, so maybe the Z is cubed. Notice how this here, there's nothing that helps join these two terms together. So how you figure out what goes here is based off the coefficient. So since they said the coefficient is 6, I'm going to assume that this is a positive 6, so I would put a plus sign here. If it said a -6, you want to use a subtraction sign. So that's how you determine. Now, the third term here, third term has a, oops, I meant to use a highlighter. Has a coefficient of 9 and no other factors. So because it says no other factors, you don't need to use variables. So a coefficient of 9, I'm going to put a 9 on my third term. And it also says it's a, it doesn't say it's a -9, so I'm going to assume it's positive. So I'm going to use a plus sign. And that's it, guys. That's how you can structure this. And this one's for 3 terms. So that's why I drew those lines to help me see that I have 3 terms and I filled them out. Now the first one here, it didn't say how many terms there are, so I'm going to assume there's 1 unless, you know, something changes in the sentence. So that's it, guys. That is all the concepts for reviewing Algebra 1. Bye, guys.